Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, false prophet of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show today is Jonny Thacker. Jonny is an assistant professor in political science at Swarthmore College and one of the founding editors of The Point magazine. He's the author of various articles, most recently one in the newest issue of The Point titled Beyond Equality. I think that issue is about kind of the future of the left. And he has written one book so far, the 2018 book, Plato as Critical Theorist. I asked Jonny on not to talk primarily about his own work, but about his late friend and mentor, Jonathan Lear, the philosopher and psychoanalyst, who I've sort of talked about and written about before. Lear is somebody I've been reading for a long time, actually a few decades. I first encountered him as an undergraduate, I think my freshman year, not him, but his book on Aristotle. And I profiled him for the Washington Post, and through that, got to meet him, interview him just on Zoom a few times. I'd been planning to have Lear on the show. I'd asked him, he said he was happy to, but he was working on something and we would push it back. And then I heard through the transom that he had died, I think, of a relatively fast-moving cancer in the fall. And I asked Jonny on to talk about him because Lear was Jonny's advisor at the University of Chicago Committee on Social Thought, where Jonny got his PhD. And as you'll hear in our conversation, Lear was also Jonny's occasional advisor on matters of the heart. As you'll know, if you're a regular listener to this show, I am not the most programmatic or systematic of podcast hosts. I generally have a sense of where I want to go, or at least some ideas I want to hit. And usually I follow in some loose sense that trajectory. But overall, I prefer to trust the process, the organic kind of unfolding of the conversation rather than script out a bunch of questions and make sure I sort of hit all of them before the end. In this case, I realized when I was kind of re-listening to the edit that my producer, Robert, put together, I realized that Jonny and I ended up doing something that was much more different from what I had vaguely planned than is customary. I had planned to cover some of the basics of Lear's thought and his writing, his career, and thinking it would be just kind of a primer on that. And instead, this became a conversation about what it means to be, or to be influenced by, to be in the orbit of the kind of person that Lear calls in one of his relatively recent essays in the book Imagining the End, calls a local exemplar, which is a model, which is someone who's had a profound influence on the people around him or her. So I mean, a local exemplar can be different things. It could be a real mentor in the classic sense, as Lear was for Jonny and other students of his. You could be that as a writer, as he was for me. It could also just be sort of occasional moments, like somebody who said or did something once or a few times that just kind of stays with us, kind of imprints on our brain and changes us over time in ways, that become clear, but maybe not easy to articulate. So we talk about how Lear constructed that concept of local exemplar. But more than that, we talk about how Lear played that role in our lives, but also about the ways in which Thacker may be playing that role right now as a teacher in the lives of his Swarthmore students, and more generally, what it is about someone or something that makes it capable of influencing us in these ways. I mean, there's a kind of obvious reason why we ended up in this space rather than the space I plan to explore, which is just it feels kind of eulogistic, elegiac. Lear just died. Thacker was a student. I was a reader of his, so we sort of thinking about the influence he had on us makes a lot of sense. But the other reason that we ended up here, I think, and maybe the main reason, is that I've been wrestling a lot lately with the question of how writing in particular does or doesn't, can or can't influence people, because I'm writing a book on relationships and therapy, and that book edges into the territory of self-help. And I have become moderately obsessed with not replicating, with two things. One is not replicating the mistake that so many self-help authors make on this front, which is thinking that in order to help people to have influence on them, the thing to do is to give them straightforward advice on how to do better. And I guess the other thing is the inverse of that. How would one actually write in such a way that it could have an influence on people? It always seems to me like a fundamental misunderstanding in so many of the kind of standard self-help books of how texts change people. And in some ways, kind of a somewhat odd or surprising one to make, in particular for the therapists and psychologists who write so many of these books. Because if anyone should understand that the human psyche is tricky and that real change tends to be a product not of advice, but of close relationships and of kind of living in communal structures, various kinds of structures playing out over time, it should be therapists, psychologists, it should be people who've devoted their lives to studying the psyche, to working with the psyche, with people's psyches to help them change. This is not to say that texts don't change people's lives. Obviously, they do. I mean, if you talk to most people, they will tell you there are books that change their lives, whether it's, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or the poetry of Emily Dickinson or the Bible. That's probably the one, religious scripture. that have changed most people's lives. What you'll see about these things is that they almost never look like self-help books. They're not linear in that way. They're poetic, they're narrative, they're elusive, they're elusive. They are not precision tools meant to achieve a predictable outcome in the brains of their readers. Lear, it should be clear, was not one of the people who misunderstood this. That was not his style. His style was, maybe lyrical is not the word. It was kind of looping. It was kind of elusive. It took a topic and kind of held it up to the light and kind of looked at it through, the light from different angles, different facets. It was recursive. I asked him once if that style, as I understood it, was deliberately constructed because it was kind of an emulation of something about the rhythms of psychoanalytic practice. And he actually was a little surprised by my characterization of that. And he said something to me like, I just try to write clearly. And that surprised me. But the more I've thought about that, the more I believe him in this sense, in the sense that I think there was something so integrated in the way that he did so many of the things in his life, the way he taught, the way he wrote, the way he, I presume, did psychoanalysis, maybe the way, this was, again, I didn't have a personal relationship, maybe the way he was a friend or a father or a husband, or a mentor. They were all so integrated, it seems to me, that his version of writing clearly became this thing that I perceived as kind of psychoanalytic, as sort of evocatively, powerfully elusive. And that it's because of this, in some sense, that his writing has the capacity to affect people in a way that most self-help literature doesn't, though in many respects it was touching on the same subjects as a lot of self-help literature. He was somebody who cared about just kind of like the basic tasks, challenges, difficulties of being human, and that's a lot of what he wrote about. So I want to drop in a clip of an interview I did with Lear a year or two ago that was kind of on this topic. I published it before. I forget precisely in what context, but it really seems worth dropping in here as well. So this is me kind of asking him about that, about his style and how he conceptualized it. If you wanted to go find a mass audience, the entire push, given who you are, would be to write some kind of self-help book, right? And it's a very different style. It's a very different structure. It's like, this is what you should do, right? Here's what is. Here's what you should do. That seems totally antithetical to me to how you would approach.
That's right.
It feels like if I were a critic characterizing you, I would say there's something psychoanalytic about it. There's something about that you can't go at these things directly.
Yeah. Thank you. You're helping me think about what I do. Certainly what I've been trying to do recently. And something about, everything is marvelous if you'll just look at it hard enough and pay attention to what's going on here. And I feel, in Socrates, you felt it was the human, that if you will pay attention to an individual moment and not let it go, you will come to see marvels open up. And then the writing is meant to invite the reader to share in the marvel of it all. That, here was something that happens every day in our midst, but actually it's amazing. And that's what I've been trying to do. I believe that, the moment starts out as a puzzle, and rather than move on to something else, stick with it and see where it goes.
I did not know Lear well as a person, but he continues to have a big influence on me. That's even more the case for Jonny, as you'll hear in the conversation. I don't want to pretend he's for everyone for a variety of reasons. His style, as I said, it is very clear in a way. It's very lucid, but it's not linear. And I don't think it's difficult in a sense, but this is somebody who's writing about, Kierkegaard and Aristotle and Plato and Kant. He's dealing with some pretty weighty topics, and sometimes it gets pretty, I would say, substantive, not deliberately difficult. So he's not for everyone, but if he might be for you, and I think you might have a good sense of that by the time you get to the end of this conversation. I really encourage you to pick up one of his books or find one of his essays online. I'll drop in links to a few of them. A bunch of them are online. They're really not hard to find. He was a really remarkable person, and he will be missed, though, as we say at the end here, he's still with us in a lot of ways. Hope you enjoy. Peace. Jonny Thacker, welcome to Eminent Americans. You're hereby anointed an eminent American by the power vested in me by the, is it the Committee on Social Thought or the Committee of Social Thought at the University of Chicago?
Committee on Social Thought.
The Committee on Social Thought, which, as I said to your point, co-founder John Baskin, when I had him on the show, I have a total social thought fantasy. I just sort of imagined it as this sort of magical place. You're an alum, right?
Yes, I am, yeah.
So your PhD is in social thought, is that right?
That's right, yeah. Social thought.
So we're here today to talk about the late, great Jonathan Lear, who I had actually been hoping to get on the show. I didn't know, I wasn't close enough to know that he was sick. And so I think he and I had talked at some point about him coming on the show, but I think he must have been sick by that point. Was he sick for a few years, kind of off and on treatments, or was it fast?
As far as I know, he was diagnosed in the early part of 2025.
And then when did he die? I'm trying to remember when that was.
Died in September.
Okay. But he was your dissertation, he was your teacher, your dissertation advisor. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you have several people on your committee, but he was clearly the most important person on my committee, the chair of the committee.
And was he a friend? Was he a personal friend in some sense, or a sort of mentor? What how would you classify him vis-a-vis you?
Very important. Hard to say quite how important, actually. I think he absolutely did kind of change my life in important ways. I mean, there are personal aspects to this. Like, I wouldn't be married to my wife if it weren't for him, I don't think. That's a longer story. But, in terms of just professionally and in terms like my intellectual life, I wouldn't be a Plato scholar if it weren't for him. No doubt about that. But I probably wouldn't be an academic either, in truth. I think I would have given up at some point just because I find certain aspects of academic philosophy quite alienating when I'm faced with reading journal articles and thinking about the kind of structure of the game, as it were, in philosophy. I think if it weren't for his example of how you could live a kind of unauthentically humane life as a philosopher, I don't know that I would have carried on, actually.
How would you tell the story of meeting him? So you show up, you're from somewhere in England, right? I mean, did you show up in the States in order to start this program, or you show up in Chicago to join this program? How do you tell that story of kind of encountering him, and the sort of trajectory of that?
I came to social thought somewhat randomly, actually, in a weird way. I was looking to get a graduate degree of some kind in order to become a writer of intellectual journalism, probably. I thought it would be better for me to have more of a kind of deep understanding of the history of thought. And I happened upon this program and thought, well, I'll apply and see what happens. And then I got in. I didn't at the time really know of anyone in there, any of the people teaching there. They weren't famous to me. I mean, I was 21 when I was applying, and I knew only the people who I'd been studying in the kind of 2.5 years of university up until then. So I'd heard of Kurt Sayer, the novelist, was there. But by the time I arrived, he had actually left.
Okay.
So I didn't come to study with anyone in particular. I did come to Chicago for social thought, but I came for the idea of social thought, not for the people. And to me, the idea was a program where you would get to read some of the greatest works that have been written, study them patiently, but without any kind of imperative to shoehorn that into academic concerns. They were quite explicit about that. They talked about how they valued the importance of good writing and thought that exceeded disciplinary boundaries or aims. And that's really what was interesting to me, becoming broader and deeper as a thinker.
I'm curious about your background kind of prior to that. If I were English, I could just listen to your accent and then probably locate you within 15 miles or something like that, or where you're from and where you went to school, all the way up through university. But it all just sounds posh to me, right, in the way that you do to Americans. I'm curious about your background. You come from upper, lower, middle, working. You're showing up at Chicago as who in that sense?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't be able to locate my accent, actually, if you're English geographically. You would be able to locate it in terms of class.
Okay.
Because, geographically, I'm from Manchester, from the South Manchester suburbs of Manchester, but I don't have a Mancunian accent because I was sent to boarding school when I was 8. And I have a relatively generic accent, I would say, for a certain kind of person who went to boarding school. Certainly not kind of Prince Harry levels of poshness. But upper middle class posh in a certain way, for sure.
So you're not sort of amongst the true elite posh, but just kind of upper middle class, educated private school, or what we would call private school.
I'd probably put it slightly above that, just because boarding schools which we know as public schools for no good reason, do put you into this sort of somewhat, it's a bit like how we talk about like a cosmopolitan elite or something, like in the world, where you don't belong in any specific place. Well, that's true if you're sent to like a boarding school, right? You're sent to somewhere where you're kind of in the countryside, growing up in sort of somewhat magnificent surroundings, institutionalized in a way whereby other people who've gone to similar schools have kind of gone to the same place as you in a weird way, but in some sense it's no place. So that differentiates you, I think, from just any kind of background that you might have according to wealth or profession of your parents or something. There's something that's happened to you that is kind of transformative in a very weird way. I don't know that it's on one scale exactly from sort of top to bottom, but it definitely marks you as a particular kind of person.
I'm trying to think of what the segue is to what we're ostensibly talking about. I'm just fascinated by this stuff, so that's partially why I'm asking you about it. But so you do that, and then you go off to university. Where did you go for undergrad?
I was at Oxford, and I did politics, philosophy, and economics, or actually they say philosophy, politics, and economics. So it was already a relatively broad degree, and so doing broad things appealed to me in social thought as well. But I didn't know what I wanted to do after university, and the default would probably have been to end up in law. And I didn't really, if that was my fate, I didn't want to resign myself to it too early. And I'd started a magazine at Oxford that was a kind of intellectual journalism magazine. And I could sort of see myself flourishing in writing those kind of articles. And so I thought, well, is there some way of doing a bit more study that will help me become a more interesting writer, like I said earlier? And I'd heard that people sometimes took 1 year in America. There's these scholarships you can go from like Oxford to Harvard and places like that on a kind of 1 year basis after college. And that seemed to be like a good solution in this respect because it kind of looks respectable, like you've got some goal in mind, but even if you don't really, you're just putting things off. So I saw an email that said, if you're interested in graduate study in the United States, come to this meeting in the evening or whatever. And I went, and it wasn't actually about that. It was about applying for a PhD. But what they said in the context of that is that masters in the United States are funded, which they're not in England fundamentally. They're funded if you do it as part of a PhD. So if you get in for the PhD, you get your master's phase paid for. And then you can leave if you want after the master's and, you've got your master's. So that seemed to me like quite a good idea.
You didn't put that in the application essay, right? Yeah.
Well, right, exactly. They said, ask your advisors for a couple of places to apply or whatever. So I did. And one of my advisors suggested University of Chicago for philosophy. And it was through looking at the website there that I saw that two members of the faculty, philosophy faculty, namely Jonathan Lear and Robert Pippin, were both part of this thing called social thought. So, well, what the hell is that? So I Googled that, obviously, and found it and thought I was in heaven. So
you get to Chicago. How did your relationship with Lear begin? Was it in a class? Was it day one? He got up in front of the students and said something kind of profound and humane and, and humble, and you were just like, this guy is magical. I want to attach myself to him. I say that somewhat in jest, except I feel like there is or was some kind of aura around him that is sort of perceptible in some sense. And maybe that's only through familiarity, but maybe not.
I think there was an aura around him in a certain way, but I don't know that led me to be initially attracted. In fact, I think at first there probably wasn't, just maybe just resistance or something like that. But no, I met him on the visit. So when I'd been admitted, they flew us out. Actually, this is very English of me, but I didn't want to put them out. I thought this is totally ridiculous to fly me from England. They can't possibly mean that. So I had a friend who was in New York for the year. And so I flew out to see him and then asked them to pay for New York to Chicago. but I met him then. And I do remember something of that meeting because I remember saying to him something about how I'd read, maybe it was Nagel or one of the kind of great philosophers from the 70s and 80s saying how they learned most in grad school from their peers. And I remember telling him that and seeing his face kind of come alive in a certain way that was unusual. He had an unusual way of relating to you where he when he kind of looked you in the eye and said, why? Just kind of paused. You remember those moments. He kind of put you on the spot in a way that felt quite dramatic by comparison with normal conversation. So I do remember that. And I remember maybe like an interaction with him at the opening of the year party or something when I'd got there. But I think he was actually off for the first little time when I arrived. I don't think I took class with him in my first couple of terms anyway. And then I took a class with him on parts of the soul. And it was basically the first half we did Plato's Republic, or just the parts on the parts of the soul. And then in the second half, we did Freud. So that was my first kind of course with him. And yeah, I mean, it definitely, something was planted in me, but I didn't have an immediate feeling of like, oh, I want to definitely work with this person. I was very much interested in Heidegger, and I thought Heidegger would what I would probably end up working on. But then the following year, he was offering a 2-quarter long sequence on the Republic where we read, so 20 weeks on the Republic, 2 weeks per book of the Republic. So we just did that really, really slowly, although actually it felt really fast because 2 weeks per book of the Republic actually is quite fast in truth. But still, it was a lot of depth. And in writing the paper for that, I found I was sort of having thoughts that seemed to me to connect quite a lot of other stuff going on in my intellectual life. And then the following year, he asked me to TA for his undergrad lectures on the Republic. So I went through, before it was the 2-quarter thing was a discussion course, but then I had him lecturing on it as well. And then I was TAing and leading a discussion section for that. So by that point, I had certainly become like someone who was living with Plato and living with Jonathan's Plato in a certain way and living with his example as well, because that's what taking repeated courses with the same professor will do. You start to expect and adopt a certain mode of questioning texts and questioning people and so on. So it was never like a conscious decision to, I want to go and become a Jonathan Lear student or something. It happened over the course of time.
One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking was, I read some Plato and Aristotle. I read some ancient stuff in college, and I've probably read a bit here and there since then, but I've always had a hard time connecting it to, I've had a much easier time connecting somebody like him and his interpretation or his books that reference that stuff than I don't think I've ever been able to live with Plato in the sense that you're talking about. And in fact, I first encountered Lear because I was taking an intro to ancient philosophy in college, and I was really struggling with Aristotle. And I went and found his book, his introduction to Aristotle, to help me kind of situate me, and was, really enjoyed it. I don't think I had the thought, this guy. I don't think I thought much about him. I just found it a very kind of lucid, accessible way of, understanding Aristotle. But I'm curious for you, and this may have happened for you in undergraduate, but it sounds like if it didn't have an undergraduate, it certainly happened in graduate school, where you really did begin to live with Plato and maybe Aristotle as well, in that more personal sense, where you sort of understood. I don't mean necessarily that you were using it to understand personal issues in your life, but you were understanding it in a sort of like, I understand why this stuff is profound. I understand why this is like a core set of texts in terms of interpreting the world. Can you talk me through that? Like, can you put yourself back in that space? Because I've never made that transition over to be able to read it directly and understand the profundity of it or the relevance of it. Though I take it as a given that it's the case because people like Jonathan Lear talk about it with such respect and reverence in a sense.
So there's a couple of different ways into this. I mean, so one is just, I will take the first half of your statement. You're like, well, it might not be that you're thinking about it in terms of your actual life and the people you're speaking to and your relationships and so on. It might just be the profundity of thought or something. But actually, no, for me, it is both. But certainly the first was there. I mean, one thing is just that Plato in particular has a psychology. So he splits people, or his Socrates, let's say, splits people into 3 different categories of soul, 3 or 5, depending on the way you count it. But once you get into the arguments for that and the textual arguments, and you try and think, well, what might have motivated this? What are the kind of psychological grounds for this in experience, as well as the kind of metaphysical grounds for this in the text? You do start actually seeing it as being more and more plausible, and you do start thinking of people as being the way that he described. You think through his categories about other people.
these are categories, 3 or 5 different types of souls, or these are 3 or 5 different pieces of a single soul?
Right. So both in a way. So this, for Plato, there's 3 parts of the soul. There's reason, spirit, and appetite. And essentially, you could say there's 3 kinds of people. And those kinds are given by which of those parts is the dominant one. So there are people whose rational part is dominant, people whose spirited part is dominant, and people whose appetitive part are dominant. And then of the last type, there's actually 3. So there's 3 kinds of appetitive people, which is why you could count it as 3 types of people or 5 types of people. So yeah, I did start looking at people in that way, and I still do. And that probably leads me to the other big part of the response I would give to you, which is just that I think with these kinds of texts, the experience of taking on the perspective of the text or the author and looking at your own world through that perspective, I think that happens much more easily in the context of a class or a seminar than in one's own reading. I don't know that, in fact, I'm relatively sure that this would not have happened if I had not been studying it in the context of those kinds of seminars. And in particular, in those kinds of seminars with somebody else who was thinking along these lines. That is, this is anticipating one of Jonathan's concepts from his last book, but he was an exemplar.
A local exemplar, yeah.
Exactly. He was a local exemplar of somebody who was taking Plato to be relevant for his own life. That's why he was teaching a course on parts of the soul looking at Plato, right? So he thought that it was that relevant, and he would bring that to life. So when he was going through some of the examples that Plato uses to try and establish his division of the soul, for Jonathan, these were vignettes, like the kind of psychoanalytic vignettes that he was very well versed in getting all the meaning out of and so on. So it felt like you didn't really have an option in his classes but to think of the text as being alive in those ways. If it wasn't alive in a way where you could kind of creatively appropriate it and think about how it might apply to your own life, then you shouldn't be studying it in the first place. He didn't really enjoy studying stuff that he didn't think was going to give him resources for his own life. That was my impression anyway.
It's funny, I'm picturing you, as a grad student in Chicago walking around sort of mainlining Plato and thinking about the different types of souls. And I'm sort of picturing you as like a neophyte therapist or something. Like they've just gone to therapy school counseling program and they're reading about attachment theory and, cognitive behavioral therapy or a neophyte kind of psychoanalyst or something. And then they just start diagnosing everybody in the world through these categories or something like that. And I'm picturing you as a young man in Chicago kind of looking out at the world, and he's that type of, appetitive soul. Is that a very accurate sense of you in that? Was it that tangible in that sense? Also, what type are you?
Oh, we don't want to get into that.
I want to.
I don't know that I went around just sort of diagnosing everybody. I think it would have occurred to me sometimes like, oh, this person is being driven by these kinds of motivations or whatever. But it was more the kind of sense that here was a theory that tied together the political, the psychological, the metaphysical, everything. So for me, the psychology has never been a central part of what I've worked on in the Republic, actually. It was just an illustration of the way in which this thought might come to life. But for me, there were things about what it is to be a good citizen, for example, what it is for there to be a healthy society, what it is for a culture to promote or get in the way of human flourishing, that kind of thing, which actually, for me, very much integrated with the reading I was doing on Marx with Moishe Postone, who was also a big Chicago professor with whom I took like many, many classes, like 7 classes or something. And so I was doing a lot of Marxism and reading Plato. Actually, for me, the psychology was more about, isn't our whole culture an appetitive culture? Isn't it a culture that's kind of inflaming our appetites? Isn't it designed to do that in a certain way? And doesn't that make it harder for us to lead the kind of lives that we would actually want to lead in our best selves or something like that? So I think it was more that than a kind of diagnostic tool or something.
So were you reading his work as well at this time over these years? Were you reading Lear?
this is also part of my own personal story or psychology or something, but I've always sort of resisted my professors in ways. And I tried not to read them too much, actually. So I definitely remember reading his essay Inside and Outside the Republic, which is a pretty classic essay about Plato's Republic and the relation of the psychology and the politics. And that was extremely influential on me. But in terms of his other books, I read Radical Hope at some point in the first few years of being in Chicago, but I don't think I actually read his other things. I've been reading, since he died, I've been reading quite a lot just to try and kind of recover him for myself. But I just never wanted to be a disciple. I'm not saying that's true of other people, that there was a general kind of let's not read Jonathan thing or whatever, but I didn't read much Robert Pippin either. I didn't read much Moïse Postone.
Sorry, I want to turn the Jonathan Lear why on you. I'm interested in that partially because it's just, it's intriguing. But I've had a version of that myself in my life that I feel like I've had to really struggle with. But I think of it as a kind of neurotic or pathological tendency on my part. I don't want to project that onto you. How do you understand, and at what point did you understand that there's a certain resistance in you to reading the work or kind of modeling yourself too much in the image of mentors or potential mentors or professors?
Yeah, in terms of when I understood this, I don't know when it became clear to me, as opposed to just a behavior that I was engaged in. But it is something I reflected on quite a lot, because I am aware, with respect to myself, and if I'm honest, I think it does relate to the boarding school thing, that I have had a series of father figures in my intellectual life, and he is the biggest of those. And, one has a certain relation with father figures, and that, as we know from psychoanalysis, can be repeated in certain ways. So you see it across the different relationships you have with father figures, that there's a certain pattern, and that can be a healthy pattern or it can be an unhealthy pattern. One thing that about father figures is that you aspire to be like them in some ways, but you also want their respect. And you don't want to be crushed by them. And I think it's very easy to be crushed by a father figure and to internalize that father figure as a figure of kind of criticism and judgment, where you're always trying to live up to this thing, but you can't ever get the approval, but you're trying to live up to this thing. And I guess my response to that kind of psychic pressure has generally been to resist it, either by, sometimes attacking. Like, I did write criticism. Like, I remember writing a paper for Robert Pippin where I was just like criticizing his work, basically. So sometimes it was that kind of separation. And other times for me, it was more just doing my own thing and trying to carve a path for myself so that I wouldn't be kind of swallowed up by that father figure, but I could rather just incorporate that intellectual orientation and direction in a way that was productive for me, but didn't put me in competition with him. I think that's a kind of an important thing in a way, that avoidance of competition.
I was thinking about possible distinctions, and I don't know this, but I'm imagining it, which was, my resistance came almost much earlier in the process, and I think maybe much more dysfunctionally, which is I would sort of sabotage any potential emotional relationship or just like an acceptance of them, like a direct acceptance of them, whoever it was, as a guide or as a model or as somebody, whatever, who could offer me support and some wise counsel before we even got to sort of like, I guess what I'm hearing from you is like, you were okay with accepting that, but then maybe one of the boundaries that you drew so as not to sort of be swallowed up was, I'll accept that kind of relationship, that hierarchical sort of relationship, but I'll draw a line, I'll draw a boundary at sort of then also immersing myself in their work and putting myself at risk of kind of thinking too much like them or something like that, which is, frankly, I think, honestly, a healthier place to put up the boundary than just like putting your hand up at any sign. I can think of distinct experiences of any sign that somebody's offering that to me. It's like, oh, well, let me fuck that up. Let me get in the way of that so that there's none of that. But it sounds like you were open to that. You could accept that, but then just kind of drew the line out from there.
I think so, although it's also true that the relationship with Jonathan was one of, at least in many respects, a certain kind of distance. It's not like he was sort of telling me what to do, offering kind of concrete guidance in many ways. I mean, there was a point in our supervision when he was supervising my dissertation where I didn't see him for a year. He never asked me. I never asked him. He would. So it wasn't. Well, it's not like he was offering that hand that you said, and then it's like, oh, do you accept it or not? And I think many people found him a little nerve-wracking. So that's part of the story here that he would leave you to talk, basically. So if you're there in his office, what would happen is he'd ask you a question. And of course, this isn't terribly surprising given his training and so on. But he would just leave you to talk. And he wouldn't do the thing that you're doing now, which is smiling and nodding. He wouldn't do any of that. And you wouldn't know whether you'd come to an end. And so you would come to an end as you'd thought it, and then he wouldn't respond in the way that normal people would. And so you'd just reprise and do it again, basically, until you'd finally convince yourself that, there was nothing more to say. And at that point, you would stop. And if you stop for a sufficient length of time, he might say something back to you. So it was an unnerving relationship to be in the first place. So I don't know if it directly responds to what you're saying, but it just contextualizes.
That's really interesting, and I'm wondering, and it might be hard for you to answer this because, of course, you came to him many years after he'd already gotten his psychoanalytic training. Is your sense that was that was downstream specifically of because obviously that's super Freudian, right? That it was downstream of that training, or that was just his sort of. There are people whose way of interacting with others, right, whose just basic affect, conversational rhythms are just off kilter in some way, right? And it is exhausting if you're in the kind of median range of those things where you're looking for certain kinds of body language or, oh, that's interesting. Like you're expecting that sort of thing. To deal with somebody who doesn't do that deliberately or otherwise is emotionally exhausting. I mean, that's in my experience.
Well, it's certainly a challenge. I don't know in terms of your actual question about where did it come from. I imagine it came from the training, but I don't know. But I didn't find meeting with him exhausting, but I think that it did depend on your level of confidence in yourself. Like, obviously, it is anxiety-inducing to have someone interact like that. That's not the normal way that people interact. I think that you needed a certain capacity to see the next stage, which is the enthusiastic stage that he would have. So I'll just give you a counter, because this is the contrast I always make about this. But there was this German social theorist in social thought called Hans Joas, professor. And Joas would do the opposite, basically. You would talk and he'd be nodding. The whole way through, he would nod. And then the minute you finished, or the second you finished, he would go, no, and just shake his head. Because he was nodding to say, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. And then as soon as he spoke, he was like, yeah, but no. Whereas Jonathan would give you this wall, which is somewhat terrifying. And then afterwards, he would very frequently, not always, but very frequently, he would say, that's great. So it was a different form of interaction, but it wasn't like all negative. I mean, he could certainly be hard. Like, he definitely wrote comments on papers where he would be like on the track changes of a paper, and then he'd stop halfway through just being like, this isn't worth it. He had that in him. But then he also had this kind of super positive thing in him. And so some people would just find that like somewhat intolerable as a relationship to be in with an advisor. And he didn't have many doctoral students, in truth. There's not many students that he actually advised relative to the number of, or whose dissertations he chaired, relative to the number of years he was in post. But for me, I liked it partly because of this thing that we were talking about earlier, which is that I didn't want somebody to be too active in a certain way. I wanted to produce my own project and be my own thinker in a way.
Let me go back to something else, which is you said, if you had a certain confidence, and I'm wondering, what is the confidence you mean? Is it like literally the in the moment confidence where you're willing to kind of fill that empty space with your own thoughts and have enough confidence that there was value to them? Or was it more the confidence of like, he may not give me the kind of affirmation that I'm accustomed to in terms of assuring me that I'm on the right track, but I have some faith in myself, and maybe I just kind of believe that he probably does think I'm on the right track, or I'm willing to take a kind of small piece of it as a stand-in for the kind of larger belief in me.
I think it's probably both. Some people in general in social life are willing to speak in silences. When there's a silence, they pipe up, and I'm definitely more one of those kinds of people. So I am confident in that respect. But I think also in terms of the broader thing about the relationship, confident that he cared, because it is the father figure thing. And it's like, the question is the love conditional? Like, are you about to fail to deserve the love, as it were? Is it going to be withdrawn? Are you going to be left without an advisor, or with an advisor who doesn't really care, who's checked out, who's given up on you? And there is a question about one's psychological orientation towards the world in terms of how one figures those people in one's imagination. Do you take that silence as implicitly hostile or not? And that obviously it's all, we're all talking, this is all psychoanalytic, obviously. We're very much in that domain of transference and so on. But I partly mean in terms of confidence, just that I think was probably disposed to thinking of him as being well disposed to me and a source of goodness and so on. So that even when, for example, even when he wrote on a paper of mine that he had to stop reading because it was just getting worse and worse, I didn't take that as being like a kind of a crushing blow to me. Like, you need criticism. I know you need criticism. Do better. Doesn't mean they don't care. In fact, the opposite, probably.
In fact, the opposite. I wouldn't even bother, in a sense, implicitly, if I didn't know that you were capable of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously the case. I mean, I imagine him as a kind of ideal father figure, and I think one of the things I imagine, and you can tell me if this is accurate or not, is that what he wants for you as a mentor, in a sort of intellectual sense, is that he has some vision in his own head of the kind of, the topography of your soul or something, or of your intellect, or its potential realization. And what he wants for you is the kind of positive development of that. And that can look like a lot of different things, right? But what he's looking for is its motion and the sort of its direction rather than a specific answer.
I think that's right. And that's the thing that I don't think I knew at the time. But reading more and more of his work, as obviously I have over the course of time and so on, and especially in this last book, Imagining the End, the talk about exemplars and so on, but also actually going back to the book I never read before, which is his book on Freud, called Love and Its Place in Nature. And I just really started to piece together that this was all deliberate. I mean, it's not surprising in a way that someone whose work is about the examined life, it's about how to live, it's about how to live in relationship with one's ideals and one's philosophical reflections, but also about how to live in relationship with the fact that we are complex psychological beings. It's not surprising that a person like that would actually have thought about how to interact with students in a way that was very deliberate and impacted on their practice. But I think I see what he was trying to do, which was what you're talking about, really, which is to clear the way for creativity. He was not interested in you saying what he thought in the way that some people are. He wasn't really interested in kind of assigning you to read the latest this, that, or the other. He wasn't really interested in the game at all of publication in the standard way, or making your name or whatever. He was interested in you trying to say something exciting and original and creative that was also well argued. He wanted to keep those two things together, that yes, things have to be kind of documented. They have to be logical. They have to be rigorous in that sense. But if it's not animated by a kind of spirit of it coming from you, something that matters to you, then it's just going to be dead on arrival in a way. And I think for him, like, philosophy was a category, like a success term. It wasn't a sociological term. It was a success, like poetry. Like, to be an actual poet is an achievement. And he thought very few people were philosophers. Like Bernard Williams, he thought was a philosopher. And he had these people in his mind who were who are genuine
What's
philosophers.
I was going to say, is it the Kierkegaard line, like in all of Christendom, are there any real Christians or something like that?
Exactly. And he kept on coming back to that line for a reason. That was the thing. It was living in relationship with ideals. And I think that his mode of interacting with students was somehow designed to achieve that. How exactly, I don't know. It's somewhat mysterious to me, but I think that it does have to do with the analytic process, this idea of remaining silent and trying to allow yourself to, as the teacher, to become a psychic resource for the student, both positive and negative. Negative in the sense of the critical voice, for sure, but also positive in the sense of, I'm going to let you speak. I'm going to listen to you. I'm not going to assume that I know what you're talking about and then, give you straight away what I think or whatever, but rather I'm going to let it come from you and I'm going to wait until you're finished. So I think there's a generosity. I think there's actually a deep generosity in there and a deep desire to unleash and emancipate a certain energy from the student. And if I contrast it with some other people where I felt like, I'm not going to name names, but you'd go in and you'd say something and it would be like, I see, you want track 14. Okay, I'll play track 14 for you.
Right.
And then you just hear, you hear that thing. You're like,
right.
And you're like, well, no, that's not quite what I was getting at. It was more this. Oh, I'm sorry, it was track 8 you're looking for. Okay,
Right.
Let's press track 8. And, it was just a totally different kind of spirit there.
I'm trying to remember. This was either in the essay that you wrote for the point after he died, or maybe it was I was just read the kind of, I think it was the acknowledgments to your book that I think was adapted from your dissertation. But in one of those things, you made it pretty clear that it was kind of only him making it evident to you that doing philosophy in a sort of unconventional but sort of authentic way was a viable path that allowed you to kind of proceed along that path, which is relevant, going back to what you were saying. You were only planning to come over, maybe you do a year or two, leave with the masters, then go, work for whomever as an intellectual journalist. I'm assuming, because I think that you've written some version of this, that you needed that specific model of doing philosophy for you to believe that could be a kind of viable life for you.
Yes, I mean, that's absolutely true. And for all that I try to resist in some ways Jonathan's writings, like I certainly didn't want to become the person that had read everything or whatever. I'm not a completist in that way. But for all that, Radical Hope, I did, as I say, read, and it did have a big impact on me. It had a big, big impact on me because of the fact that this is not a normal philosophy book. This is absolutely breaking the mold, to the point where just rereading it, in the last couple of days, I can't help thinking, where did this book come from? Like, how did you think of doing this book? How did you think of pulling it off? How could you have held these ideas in your mind? The combination of this kind of the empirical detail here and the philosophical spirit of it, it is somewhat miraculous, actually. And, it did give for me the sense that there's something you can do that's really exciting. I don't think I could do that, to tell the truth, but that there's a possibility of like making your own way in the world somehow. Like this book does not fit within any genre. He calls it philosophical anthropology, except that's not really a genre either.
It's funny. I was thinking about when you talked, you said there was an essay you read, and what was it called? Love and
Love and Its Place in Nature, the book on Freud.
So I was going to say, whenever somebody, other than Imagining the End and Radical Hope, Imagining the End just because I read it most recently, and then Radical Hope because it's so differently, I kind of think of Jonathan's books as all one book, with the exception of Radical Hope. Like, I couldn't tell you where I read something of his. There's 4 or 5 or 6 collections that in my head are just one. There's musicians like this too, right? It's just one big book that he happened to kind of slice off at different points. It's a certain style of essay. He has a certain kind of abiding preoccupations. He returns to them in different ways. And then there's this thing, Radical Hope, which is like a totally different thing and is very distinct. And what's funny, you're saying, like, how can you do a work of philosophy like this? I would have said that in a sense about all of his work. Like, I don't think most of his books look like conventional academic philosophy. Maybe they look like other kinds of things, maybe like essay collections or something like that, but they certainly don't look like the kind of thing that would typically be assigned in a philosophy class. But yes, radical hope is its own. Can you, just because I'm realizing I recklessly assume immense amounts of knowledge on the parts of my listeners, and so far that's worked for me more or less, but like, how do you describe radical hope? Let's just make clear what it's about and what we're talking about here when we're saying it's this very kind of unusual type of book.
Well, it's a book about what he calls ethics in the face of cultural devastation. It's a book about the Crow tribe and how they navigated the destruction of their way of life. But it takes off from a statement made by the former chief of the Crow, Plenty-Coup, who said that after the buffalo went away, nothing happened.
And he found this in, like, it was a sort of oral history that he had given to a friend or something like that,
Well, actually,
right?
he had read it in a history class that he took as an undergrad, and it stuck in his mind. And as it becomes clearer and clearer about this in his own writing, in Imagining the End and so on. And I've talked to him about him in person, but Jonathan was clearly somebody who lived with phrases that were rattling around in his head. That someone had said to him at one point, and it just stuck in his head. And he would meditate on them and get all the possible meanings and ramifications out of them. And it would never step away from his mind at some level, toying with them. And this was a phrase like that. And then he started to want to learn more and more about it. And so he read about the history of the Crow, and he comes up with this kind of account of the statement about after the buffalo left, nothing happened, that might have meaning in terms of coming to grips with the devastation of a culture, that certain kinds of action are no longer possible anymore. It's no longer possible to be a crow in a world in which the traditional crow activities are not possible because they require a certain infrastructure, like the infrastructure of nomadic life, for example, nomadic warring life. And then it's a book about how Plenty-Coup tries to kind of navigate that experience and find resources for approaching the future in a way that maintains some sense of the core virtues of the Crow culture, like courage, for example. So it's a book that's very historically oriented. There's a lot of description of different sources and so on about Crow life. At the same time, the point isn't really about the Crow. The point is really, like, even if he's wrong about the Crow in his interpretation, this is a possibility in human life. It's a possibility that the ways of valuing that we have on our normative landscape, the landscape with which we orient ourselves towards what's really good, that kind of way of being could just collapse, that it's fragile. We can have anxieties about it because one of our modes of vulnerability is that the horizon of meaning can collapse for us. And the question is, how do we go on in those circumstances? And Plenty-Coup and the Crow are just, illustrations of that fundamentally, but concrete ones that give a lot more texture to it than would otherwise be the case.
It's funny, as you're talking, you said, like, he was obviously somebody where phrases stuck in his head, and there are two things in particular I remember from Imagining the End. One of them is in the essay on local exemplars, and I'm going to forget. I forget what the thing was that teacher said, but he had that teacher who I think maybe he described as like a kind of dragnet style cop, like he had sort of a crew cut. He was so old school. He'd heard young Jonathan say something a little bit inappropriate on the school. Do you remember what he said to him? And
he thinks he said, "God damn it."
Okay, and then what did the teacher say, Mr. McGillicuddy?
The teacher says, "We do not use profane words in the playground."
Right.
Oh no, well, we do not use profanity in the playground, or something like that.
And then walks away, right? No punishment. Walks away. And it becomes kind of emblematic for Lear of the way that certain people in our lives can kind of intercede in a very dramatic in the sort of, theatrical sense of it, in a sort of dramatic say something that has a little bit of mystery to it or a little bit of inscrutability to it, can kind of fix in our mind. It becomes a kind of introject in the psychoanalytic sense. And our lives, our personalities, our psyches can kind of shift around it, right? Around that kind of local gravitational center. The other one is, I forget the name of the essay, but when he's talking about the graduate student or the academic who got up at the climate change conference and said something about, the idea of humanity ceasing to exist because of climate catastrophe.
We will not be missed.
We will, we will not be missed, right? And then he talks about essentially everything that's wrong with that perspective, or again, that perspective as he understood it in the moment, and then alternatives to that, right? Which is obviously a connection to what he's talking about in Radical Hope, which is imagining. I mean, we literally the title of the book, which has lots of different meanings, but imagining the end of kind of human existence is one of them. I was going to say, what's interesting is I'm not sure if Jonathan is somebody who actually says things like that stick in. I'm not sure if he's a coiner of phrases in that sense. I don't have.
Well, I think he was. So yeah, in the tribute we did to him in The Point, Agnes Callard writes about this, how she remembers she was an undergrad at Chicago in a course that he taught. And she one day she couldn't make her section of the precept or discussion section or whatever, so she went to another section thinking, well, it doesn't really matter. And he, at the end of the class, took her to one side and says, "Never do that again. The classroom is a community," and walks off. But also, I have my own kind of example of this as well. I think I have a couple actually, but. Yeah, I have a couple of examples. So of the things that I remember in terms of, if someone said, well, what advice did he give you as a writer? Two things. One, I remember him just reading a chapter and just saying, there needs to be more final cause here. Like, as in, there needs to be more of a sense of what the end is going to be. We're working towards that end. That was it. And then in the class, I remember him giving advice to the whole class. He said, my advice on writing a paper is as follows. A good paper has a beginning, a middle, and an end. and then maybe a third one at the end of my dissertation. I did talk about this in my tribute. I think at the end of my dissertation, we had the dinner and whatever, the congratulations, etc. And normally, you'd expect kind of a certain amount of smoke blowing at that point. He just says to me, it needs to be better.
Yeah, you did say that. Thanks, buddy.
and I held that. I've held all of those phrases in my mind when writing, in a way that, like, there's no other person who's given me advice about writing that has stuck in my mind. Actually, these are exactly the kind of phrases that he talks about. They're enigmatic. They're short. They're memorable. They're enigmatic, and they lead you to ponder on it with your imagination in such a way that they come back for you, little snippets that come back as you're like doing other things or whatever. This phrase just comes into your mind. And you said like how his books all feel like one book, and I think that's absolutely true, because obviously without the Aristotle book, there are some exceptions.
Right. There's some exceptions.
Aristotle
right.
book. There's the book on Freud that's actually a kind of a primer type of thing or whatever. But ignoring those, there's a lot of books that have that structure, and I feel like with him, it's a bit like Marx describes Milton, and he says something like Milton was writing in the way that a spider was weaving his web. Like, it just came out of him, like, without, as a function of his nature, this pattern just came out, And I think that's how Jonathan was writing in a certain way as well, except that it was more self-reflective, obviously, but because he ended up thematizing this. And I started to think that that's really what, like, his last book is kind of an autobiography, actually. What he's doing is mourning. Like, that's what all of his work is mourning.
Yeah, right.
He has these figures in mind. They're people from his life. They could be someone who said to him, no profanity in the playground, or they could be somebody who said some other thing to him, but who made him read the Gettysburg Address aloud, or somebody who used the phrase King Lear when he was little. Throughout his work, there's these kind of phrases that some local person gave to him. But then there's also this constellation of philosophers and writers who he's kind of in touch with. So obviously Plato, Aristotle, Kierkegaard. Heidegger is suppressed. He rarely comes up in a quote. In quote form, Heidegger rarely comes up for Jonathan, but he's there in the language and the conceptual scheme often. But Plato, Aristotle, Kierkegaard, Freud are almost always there. They're always some kind of constellation. But then there are some other figures. Kant comes up in Radical Hope, for example. But that's how, he seemed to think, he'd set up these paradigm figures that were, as he would put it, split off in a certain way. They were just idealized fragments of themselves that were just hanging around. And then he'd relate himself to them and orient himself and try to kind of creatively appropriate that constellation for some new context that's immediately occurring, like, Harry and Meghan getting married or something. And,
Right.
and then the web would be spun based on this new context. The web would be spun in the way that a spider's going to make a slightly different web in different contexts. But the resources were kind of roughly the same. I mean, they add, obviously, over the course of his career, he develops more resources. And there are some contemporary philosophers. Cora Diamond comes up a lot. Bernard Williams comes up a lot. And there are some writers, whether that's Marilyn Robinson or Kurt Sayer or whoever.
Well, you said this already, but I just want to make sure it's so connected. It's all of those, but it's also the thing you said earlier about the things that stuck in his head. So if it's the spider weaving his web, it's attaching from a specific, often a specific phrase or thing that he heard or thing that he read, right? It's like whatever it was Meghan Markle said when she was talking to Oprah, or it's this academic who says we will not be missed when contemplating the end of humanity or something like that, or this moment with his teacher who says, profanity. So it's these things that have been dwelling in his mind, and then it's this kind of pantheon of particular figures and filters through whom he will run these things, and then the web is woven, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that focusing on a given phrase is, of course, very psychoanalytic as well. Like, this thing is ripe with meaning. And he said that in his interview with you, that it looks like a lot to hang on a moment, but actually there's a lot of meaning in given moments. We just normally move on from them.
I want to ask you a question about yourself. I mean, it kind of in light of these things, because when you're talking about his writing, or I'm imagining his process of writing, that's very easy for me to sort of kind of empathize with. Like, it's not that different from how, I'm an experienced writer, you're an experienced writer. It's not that different in certain elements from how I sort of, from the inside, experience writing something or writing different things over time. The one that I'm a little bit more mystified by or curious about is the kind of local exemplar as a teacher, can one fashion oneself into the kind of person who says things like that, right? Because it's so dramatic, right? And when I think about myself and the people who have a relationship to me, let's think of my kids, right? Like, when I'm dead and gone, there are things my kids will remember about me that were characteristic Dan things. But they're not that. They're not this sort of sudden kind of, cryptic phrase, perfectly phrased. It's like, Dad did this thing where he always like made jokes around, like I call my kids like brotato chip and broheme and like bromato soup and like just ridiculous things, right? That come from who I am, but they're sort of organic, they're kind of loose. I'm not somebody who intercedes at a moment. And the question for you is, I'm interested because you're a professor, so you're somebody who structurally, professionally is in relationship to young people much more consistently than I am. And like, do you think about fashioning yourself as a person who can have that influence on people?
Not in that way, no. I mean, I think, yeah, it's interesting to me. I agree. Fashioning yourself to be the kind of person who makes enigmatic utterances
has that, I guess maybe has that kind of care. It could look different ways, but has that kind of charismatic influence on other people. And like, most of the time it's not sort of conscious and deliberate, but if in anyone it was conscious and deliberate, it was probably in him, or if not that, it was an artifact of the kind of psychoanalytic practice or something. But I'm always interested with professors, and I imagine you going into your classroom at Swarthmore, and you have this relatively posh English accent, and you're a little scruffy in a kind of romantic way, and all the young faces are looking up at you, and many of them are actually what they want from you. Aside from learning and an exciting classroom experience, they want to have that kind of charismatic experience from you. And I don't know do you think about that?
I do a little bit. It's a hard question. It's a really hard and to some degree uncomfortable question. I mean, there's a sort of narrow thing to say, which is just that I'm quite a talkative person, and so I have a really hard time having the kind of distance that can lead you to be a good enigmatic figure in a way.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it really
out there.
Right? It really helps.
Away, right?
Right. It really helps to be able to hold yourself back in important ways, to then have that kind of golden touch that when you do say something, it's very memorable. A second thing is just that I'm a lot less liable to give praise than most people.
Okay, that's good. So you're withholding. That's an important one.
I don't like praise. I don't like receiving praise. And
Yeah.
if someone starts praising me, I kind of close my ears. Like I don't like it, and I don't like giving it really either.
You should work on both those things.
Well, I do think that one thing that means though is that if I do give praise, it can have some of that. I'm conscious that it does mean a bit more because I don't do it often. So if I do it, I do think it becomes more of a scarce currency, and you have to be aware of that as a teacher. That's currency that you can spend easily or not. And I'm one of the people who doesn't spend it much. There's the one thing I'm thinking of that might be an equivalent that I do always is or often is tell my students that my goal in pedagogy is to make them dissatisfied. I want them to think that the course was not enough.
In what sense? Or you just stop there? You just stop there and let them make of it what they will.
So I think it's very important that what we do in the humanities is not like what we might do in like a medicine course or something. We're not like covering the kidney where like once you've covered it, you kind of tick the boxes and you're like, okay, I can pass the exam. Now I can do what it is I need to do at my level of medicine. And if I need to be like a, rhinologist or whatever, then I can go and study further or whatever. But fundamentally there's a box of knowledge and I've kind of done that box now. What I'm trying to do is create an orientation towards a certain kind of area of value. I want students to come away thinking that they need inside themselves, they actively want to go further in this direction, that they haven't done everything that they can in this direction, that this is a journey that they are now on and it's their journey to take, but it's not one that I've kind of foreclosed in any way or wrapped up for them. I kind of think of it a bit like this is sort of a weird analogy in a way, but it's kind of surgical. So like when I broke my wrist, they said, there's a danger here that a non-union forms, meaning the bone doesn't heal back together. It heals sort of like there's two bits and they're not back together. In that case, we have to do surgery. And what we do with the surgery is we chop off one of the ends so that there's a wound so that it can stop moving again and growing back again. And I think there's a way in which like you have to, one of the goals of teaching in the humanities is to create a wound. It's like you need to cut off the scab, as it were, or you need to cut off the whatever it would be, the hump that has like we've arrived at, where we think we know what we value, we think we know what's good and true and beautiful, and we think we understand a given domain of human experience or whatever it might be. There's lots of different ways of putting that. You need to kind of cut off that layer of skin and bone that's kind of calcified on top of those questions that we had when we were like teenagers. We had them very strongly, or preschoolers even. And you need to kind of open that wound so that the student wants to, from the core of their own being, they want to develop in this direction and they want to discover more and so on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's something where that's one area where I'm quite conscious of how we could get in the way of that by giving them sort of a packaged answers.
Well, I guess, I mean, it does answer my question. I mean, it leaves me a little bit dissatisfied in the best way.
No, well, that's the goal. So,
no, I guess what I was thinking, as a teacher, how do you? I mean, this is something I think we all, we struggle with if we want to grow and develop and become better, whether it's in kind of in a personal sense or in a professional or creative sense, and it's not always easy to do or easy to see. In some cases, particularly when you get to a certain level of capacity with it, right? Like, I know I'm a good writer. You probably know you're a good teacher and you're a good writer, right? And so there's not the kind of obvious sort of seams in what you're doing. And then it's like, how do I get better at that thing? And I think sometimes the creation of sort of charismatic charge, whether it's in writing or therapy or teaching or speaking or something like that, it's not some deliberate self-fashioning. It's cultivating some capacity to continue to get better or to sense where there is something where there's either the potential for growth or some kind of inadequacy that could be remedied. And I'm curious for you as a teacher, how you identify that thing, or what your sort of struggle with it is.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. You know, so something, if I could throw it back to Jonathan, I discovered this thing after he died that I'd somehow never seen before, which was his Aims of Education address to the University of Chicago in 2009 to incoming students. And he talks about how the goal of education is for us to become students. And I found that very inspiring, and I think it's relevant to the teaching thing, because I think the thing you have to do to constitute yourself as a teacher who develops over time rather than crystallizing is to remain a student. And you have to consider yourself to be learning from the classes. And if you're not, it's going to calcify and it's going to become routinized. And there may be some developments you can have, like, here's some new exercise I came up with to get the students to do such and such. And that's all well and good, and I should probably do more of those innovative things. But the truth is, I don't really. We sit and we talk about the books mostly, and there's no kind of tricks or pedagogical innovations in there. It's it really is much more about what does this passage mean, and is it true, and how does it relate to our lives and stuff. But I think sometimes I feel with a given text like I'm not learning anymore. And I feel a bit that way with the Republic, to be honest. This is highly maladaptive from the point of view of academic life, because, in academic life, once you become an expert on something, you should really milk that and keep going with it. But I sort of feel like certainly, especially when I'm lecturing on it, I feel like, well, kind of bored with hearing myself talk about this now. I've got myself in a position where I kind of have to. But so some of it is teaching new things, and I do try and do that. I teach far more. If I compare myself to my colleagues, I'm constantly teaching new courses. Or if I have the same name for a course, I'll change the contents of it completely, because I just can't face that. So some of it is trying to make sure that you are on the edge, in a way, of your own competence. But there are other things, like in terms of technique, I don't know that I have it right, actually. I mean, we teach we're doing this thing with a point called the Point Program in Public Thinking at the University of Chicago. And I've taught twice in summer courses there, and we have a totally different pedagogy. And it's much more centered on students writing and thinking with each other. And it's really interesting. It's much more innovative and much less traditional. And when I teach in that, I think, maybe I need to I need to cut open my bone as a teacher there as well, and kind of be like, rather than going back in the path that I'm used to, maybe I need to have that wound of like, do I really know what it is to teach a good class, especially to this generation of students? Because it might just be a different set of demands that they have,
It is pretty remarkable, and this is certainly something that Jonathan wrote a lot in the context of psychoanalysis. But it's not exclusive to psychoanalysis. Like, it is pretty extraordinary that if one is able to put oneself in kind of the right relationship to learning, openness, therapy, teaching, reading, writing, the right relationship of kind of openness, it's kind of miraculous that development kind of almost inevitably ensues, right? It's not easy to get into that space, but that is a premise of a lot of therapy, right? Like, if you can get in right relationship to whatever's going on with you and you just keep going, you can kind of, there's a phrase like that, trust the process, right? Like, that development will ensue. And that is a pretty extraordinary and a kind of miraculous fact of human existence, or something like that. But what I was going to say just before, because I didn't want to get off this conversation without learning this story, you said in some way Jonathan was responsible for you ending up with your wife, and I'm curious what that story is. So maybe if this story ties the bow on our conversation perfectly, then I'll end at the end of it, and otherwise maybe I'll have one more question. But yeah, what's that story?
Well, maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that. He didn't introduce us, not at all. It was this is quite personal, but I twice went to him for relationship advice, which is interesting because he says somewhere in one of the prefaces to his books that he never talks to his students on a personal level. But actually, twice at very critical moments in my life as a student, I went to him for advice about relationships. And on both occasions in his full self, as it were, like his self as a philosopher, as a psychoanalyst, someone who knows psychology, and as someone who's been, married and divorced and stuff like that. And on that second occasion, it was because I was going to get married to someone else.
Oh, wow.
So that's what happened and why it's such a long story. I can't get into the full story of it, but that's another moment where he said something where the phrase sticks in my mind. Actually, the phrase he said was, I'm so I emailed him, I think, and then he was like, "You got to come over to my apartment right now." So I came over, and it was night, and we talked about it, and he said, "I'm so glad you've come over because in my experience, cold feet before a marriage very quickly become frozen feet." And again, we talked more, so there were other things that came out, but he talked about his own experience, and he was modeling it on that in truth. But he what he was saying was that you can become incapable of acting, and so you just kind of keep going on the path. You're on a kind of travelator. When you're like a few weeks away from a wedding, you're on a travelator. It's moving forward, moving walkway, or whatever you want to call it. It's moving forward without you. So you could quickly just become frozen in place by the fear. And in general, he was always...
So it wasn't actually what I first thought it meant was it wasn't actually cold feet as a sign that you shouldn't do it or that there's something intrinsically wrong. The point was when you're even trying to think clearly about what you should do, recognize that in fact it kind of almost has the inverse effect, which is you can't get off the train.
Paralysis is a decision in its own way, is one way of putting it. But I think also in general, he was always very against defensiveness in a way. And he kind of wanted to create a space that liberated you to kind of think. And in that case, I think he saw that the panic that can come can lead you to shut down and not actually think about what's right for you. He would never have as you can imagine, from everything I've said, he would never have said, well, look, here's what to do. But he did say, here's what my own experience was. And, here's how it went for me. And then, if you need to make a brave decision that will be very difficult for you, just know that you can do it. And, it's actually better for you and for everybody than not making a decision you think is right. But he didn't, or than making a decision you think is wrong, or ending up making a decision just by making no decision, even when that's the wrong thing to do. So yeah, he wasn't being interventionist in the first order, but really on the second order of getting me to actually try and make the decision.
There is, and I think therapists in particular, and maybe psychoanalysts really in particular, are incredibly attuned to this sort of trickiness of saying things that can actually be of help to people, and the temptation and the risk of trying to tell people what to do, and the ways that tends to sort of fail. I think what I was going to say, and I'm trying to think if this is true, but maybe you'll have a better sense if it's true. Is I don't think there are any. I don't even know what it would be like to be a Jonathan Lear disciple, at least in the sense of being a writer, and that maybe is sort of evidence of that, right? What would it even mean to be of the Jonathan Lear school of whatever? I feel like I have been profoundly influenced by him. I don't think the way I write looks anything like what he does, nor you, right? I mean, and if you went around to the people who've had felt the most kind of profound impact on their lives from him, they wouldn't look like him, which I think is a testament to the very sort of distinctive nature of his work, his personal interaction with people, but for me, his writing and his teaching.
That's absolutely right. I mean, he did, there were elements you could pick out, he writes clearly. He doesn't overburden things with footnotes. Irrelevant arguments are not in there, which actually is already a massive exception for most philosophy, which is overburdened by irrelevant objections and stuff like that, or unnecessary precision, where you're pretending that there's going to be some misunderstanding, and so you have to kind of flesh it out over the next 15 pages for no real gain or whatever. There are things like that where you can say, oh, there's a certain model that you can do or whatever. But it's absolutely nonetheless the case that his work feels like his work. It's coming from his individuality, his place in the world, his own preoccupations, and his own kind of creative intelligence. And, that was what I meant in a way when I read the Freud book, Love and Its Place in Nature, where I saw this line about, or it's a repeated theme in the book, but about how the goal for Freud and for psychoanalysis more generally is to create genuine individuals. And then you have to think about, how do I, as an exemplar, promote individuality of other people rather than having them be kind of disciples? I mean, and he's very interested in Socrates, and Socrates, this is a theme in the dialogues. In the Plato Symposium, there's a guy who dresses up like Socrates and tries to be like Socrates or whatever. But, Plato isn't like that. But Plato is the greatest Socratic inheritor, but isn't like that. Aristotle's the greatest Platonic inheritor, but isn't like Plato. So there is this kind of ability for some people to pass on individuality to others, but it does have to be individual. I completely agree, and it is the individuality in his writing is actually one reason to kind of what I think, what I feel like reading him now, which I've been doing for the last few days and since he died, is really an act of mourning in his sense, because I feel maybe much more than with other writers that he is there in his writing. And I'm going to be a bit non-English now, but which you'll enjoy. I cry quite often reading his work. Really, it makes me cry
because you feel him there in some sense. You feel
yes, yeah. There's a couple of things. One is that I cry at magnificence in general. Bob Dylan makes me cry quite frequently as well. But so there's some of that, and I can't tell apart actually. Is it like when I'm rereading the essay on We Will Not Be Missed, or the essay on when Harry married Meghan? I can't tell. Is it the writing? Is it the ideas? Is it the history? Since actually I edited both of those pieces for the point. Is it the person that's coming through? I think it's the person that's coming through, and the loss of that person, and the fact that they're alive in the writing. And many people, I guess that's what I'm saying, many people are not alive in their writing. So he is alive in his writing, but he's dead. And so that gives a particular pathos for me as someone who, I do miss him, and, I do still need his advice, and he's not there. So his presence for me is in these books. And I think that's a really remarkable thing for a writer to achieve. I can't tell how much of it is my personal story, my personal projection or whatever, and how much is there in the text. But I think you're saying that you feel some of that too, that he's there in his writing.
Yeah. Well, that's really lovely, Jonny. Thank you for doing this. This was really great. I feel a little bit as you're talking, he's here in the room, as it were.
He is.
And I don't know how to pass that on to people. I mean, but I feel compelled to, right? In some way, whatever form that takes. It's not even go read Radical Hope, it'll blow your mind or something like that. It's just a sense that if people could bring themselves in relation to him in some sense, because I had this before I met him, and I just met him on Zoom a few times, that if you could bring yourself in relation to him, that will benefit you. And I don't know how or in what that would look like for you, whoever you are listening to this. I just have an intuition that, and maybe not for everyone, right? And not everybody's for everyone, but for some of the people, it would just be meaningful. It would be a meaningful relationship with him through his work. And, alas, not through him anymore individually.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to my editor, producer extraordinaire, Robert Scaramuccia. Big thanks as well to Alec Ownsworth of Clap Your Hands Say Yeah for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you liked what you heard, and I imagine you did, if you've made it this deep into the episode, then please rate us on whatever the relevant podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or comments, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond at least until the faraway and probably mythical day when I have such a vast audience that I can't in good conscience respond to all the emails while still upholding my responsibility to my loved ones. Have a great day.